The Protestant churches can be divided into those that have promoted biblical literalism and those which have not. The largest among the literalist churches are the independent fundamentalist Baptist churches, which also promote creationism and other fundamentalist beliefs, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Pentecostal churches, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the so-called traditionalist Lutheran synods. Except for the Baptists, tracing their origins in the 17th century, all other denominations were founded in the mid-19th or in the 20th century. Interestingly, the literalist denominations are exclusively American Protestant churches. That essentially means that no Christian church outside North America has a biblical literalist doctrine. Bible literalism is indirectly connected to religious fundamentalism, but religious fundamentalism is more centered on rejecting reason and science and belongs to a different category because not all of the aforementioned literalist churches explicitly reject reason. This presentation strictly focuses on biblical literalism and whether it can be reconciled with Christianity or even with the Christian canon that the literalists regard as their inspiration. Bible literalists assume that a literal reading of texts has been the traditional practice in the Christian Church. Nonetheless, the first enunciation of this belief stems from the Conference of Presbyterian Churches in North America, specifically the North Presbyterian General Assembly of 1910. Among the statements made at the conclusion of the conference was one regarding the literal validity of biblical miracles as disruptions of natural law. This pronouncement almost certainly led to the eventual rise of religious fundamentalism in North America. A meeting of fundamentalist Protestants in 1978 resulted in a separate but not unrelated statement, the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. It is stated that the Bible must be interpreted in its literal or grammatical sense, strictly forbidding the allegorizing of historical narratives of the Genesis. The literalists treat the Christian texts as scientific or historical writings, and the followers of this movement seek new interpretations based on the literal meanings of words in the English language. There are three main grounds why biblical literalism is inadmissible, and they will be presented in sequence. First of all, there is the semantic stratification of the Greek language. This is perhaps the most serious challenge and one that has not been taken into consideration by the promoters of biblical literalism. Biblical literalism is an American idea based on translations of ancient texts into modern English. Ironically, there is no word for literal or literally in the Greek language. Indeed, a Greek word had to be invented in the 20th century following the literalist movement in America after 1910 to express the Protestant concept of literalism. This new Greek word is kyriolektismos. The original religious texts of Christianity were written in Greek. The Greek texts were translated into Latin beginning in the late 4th century and eventually into modern European languages after the Reformation in the 16th century. As was presented in my previous video, the Greek language has a characteristic that is completely absent from the English language. The scientists and philosophers of classical antiquity did not invent new technical terms to express the increasing refinement of their ideas, as we tend to do today. Instead, words with familiar lay meaning were used with increasing sophistication within a text. New layers of meaning were added with every philosophical debate. For example, the word arche, which would have ordinarily meant a beginning, was being used in the sense of origin, authority, axiom, principle, first principle, cause, and in the sense of a first cause. This is similarly the case for the words used for the three members of the Trinity and for a host of theological concepts such as essence, substance, nature, that is physis, nature, and hypostasis. These layers of meaning are completely absent from the nearest equivalent English words in the English translations. A doctrine of literalism had never been previously pronounced because literalism in Greek is an impossibility. Understanding depends on the education and intellect of the listener, and it is not independent of context. So that a word for literal had not been invented in the Greek language until the American movement began essentially in the 20th century. On this account alone, the idea of biblical literalism is a modern invention as well as a fallacy, being impossible to apply to the original Greek text. Then there is the Economia of the Church. In the Orthodox Church, that is, among all Orthodox Christians, past and present, it is widely understood that the various writings of the Church appeal to different people at different stages in their development. This has been stated by many of the saints, as it has already been explained in a previous video. Just as a child that may count up to 10 inquires if there are further numbers and cannot even imagine the mathematics taught at school or at university, in the same way when Christianity has to be introduced for the first time, one should begin with simple texts in a language familiar to the understanding of the listener, who in antiquity would have been likely a pagan, and possibly not always well educated. Potentially there could be a young child. Generally, those in their early steps of learning about Christianity left no writing, no words of literature and theology. This is unlike all kinds of born-again Christians today, who can be very vocal on the internet and who are promoting the most simplistic or personal beliefs as if they were the understanding of all other Christians. Among the texts most accessible to a person unfamiliar with Christianity are the passages in the book of Genesis, where God makes things a bit like a common laborer, a potter perhaps, or in the manner of Zeus and similar gods, who can create things out of nothing, and which gods were familiar to the people of antiquity. In addition, the earliest texts in the Old Testament provide a set of moral guidelines, such as the Ten Commandments. Scripture conveniently starts so, as it would be impossible for a newcomer to comprehend the more complex theology until the language of the Church, and in addition the language of Plato, Aristotle, and their followers, could be understood, which may come much later in one's education and development, at least in the case of younger individuals. When Thomas Aquinas first discovered in the Middle Ages the works of Aristotle and began to see Aristotle's ideas based on logic and empiricism resonate with Christian theology, he proclaimed that what is divinely taught to us by faith cannot be contrary to what we are endowed with by nature. Since we have both of them from God, he would be the cause of our error, which is impossible. One wonders how Christianity was being understood by other Christians in the Latin Church before Aquinas stumbled on Aristotle, and how many Western Christians today appreciate the understanding of the saint. The Christian texts are somewhat as the books of arithmetic and mathematics one has at school. With every advancing grade, a pupil receives a new book of arithmetic or mathematics, even more complex than that of the previous year. The insistence of some literalists in personal so-called literal interpretations of Christianity, based alone on their own reading of the first page of the book of Genesis, tells much about one's lack of progress in understanding Christianity. Then there are the myths of the book of Genesis. The Greek word for scriptures is graphe, writings. There is another Greek word used more commonly, that of historiae, stories. The word is the root of the modern discipline of history, but in ancient times, before the modern discipline of history had come into existence, the word normally had the meaning of stories, including fables. Aesop's fables are also called in Greek Esopohistoriae, the histories or stories of Aesop. St. Basil, in his Address to Young Men on Greek Literature, describes the merits of some of the Greek stories, which he contrasts with the stories of the Old Testament regarding their edifying value. In comparing them to the stories of the Old Testament, he makes it implicit that he was not considering the relevant texts necessarily as historical facts or as scientific facts. Their relative merit was in their edifying value. The parables of Christ are among the Christian texts which we do take as non-historical in the modern sense. Instead, we value them precisely for their edifying value. It has become increasingly apparent in the last 100 years since the discovery and decipherment of texts from ancient Mesopotamia that the stories of the book of Genesis were cultural beliefs shared by the ancient peoples of the Fertile Crescent. The difference with the Old Testament presentation is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the myths are attributed to one god rather than to an assembly of gods. The narratives are otherwise comparable. For example, the stories of the creation of the earth and sky from the waters can be found in a Mesopotamian myth. It is a myth about a goddess called Namu, personified by the waters that fill the universe. She was the waters that fill the universe. The goddess creates the earth and sky within the waters, as detailed in Tablet 1 of the An-Anam list. There the goddess Namu is called the mother who gave birth to the heavens and the earth. This tablet dates from the Middle Babylonian period, around 1300 to 1100 before Christ. One must understand that in Babylonian cosmology, the earth was imagined as a relatively flat land in one depiction encompassing Mesopotamia, that is modern-day Iraq. That was the earth. The earth was covered by a solid firmament, the sky, which supported itself on the mountains around Mesopotamia. The earth and sky formed together a kind of bubble that was completely immersed in the waters that filled the universe. This was a very old belief because an even earlier Sumerian myth from around 1900 to 1600 BC already refers to the goddess of the waters having created the earth and sky in the old days when heaven and earth were split from one another. So this myth predates any kind of science and even the monotheism of the Old Testament, and of course cannot be taken as divine revelation delivered to us via the Sumerian clay tablets. There are other ancient myths of this kind that have parallels in the book of Genesis. They have been found on tablets written in the Sumerian language or in Akkadian, which was the language of ancient Babylonia, Assyria, and later the language in which the Epic of Gilgamesh was written. One of these myths tells of a Garden of Eden, literally Eden, placed in the appropriate location where the Bible places it in Mesopotamia. The Bible says that the Garden of Eden was at the confluence of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. In fact, Eden is a Sumerian word also found in Akkadian, the language of the Babylonians. In Sumerian mythology, paradise is located at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Guidea cylinders of 2125 BC explicitly mention the Eden Canal as a place located in southern Mesopotamia. There is a Babylonian story about a character called Adapa, the first man. The word Adapa means wise, and he was the first man to have been created, but he was deceived by God not to eat a particular type of food, and by not eating it, he became mortal. Adam, a similar sounding word as Adapa, that means man in Hebrew. That is the meaning of the word Adam in Hebrew. It means man. So he was deceived by a demon to eat a fruit that made him mortal as a consequence. So both the Babylonian and Old Testament traditions present the creation of humanity from a single man, and this man indeed was created from clay. And both traditions involve God or gods breathing life into the clay. In ancient Sumerian, the first man created by the gods was called Enki. After creating him, the gods created Ninti, the first woman, as his spouse. Her name means Lady of Life. Interestingly, it also means Lady of the Rib. That was a pun because it was said that the first man, Enki, was lonely, and out of loneliness his ribs were hurting. And so comes the Lady of the Rib. It was an ancient pun, which also means Lady of Life. The ancient Mesopotamian myths have various parallels also of Noah's flood. It is not the case that these are historical records of floods. Rather, they are myths regarding decisions made by the gods. Often a common formula appears in these myths, that of the assembly of gods, which in Hebrew would be represented by the word Elohim. However, after the Greek Testament was compiled in the 2nd to 3rd centuries BC, the convention was changed so that in Hebrew, Elohim with a capital E has since been taken to mean a single God, although the word is in the plural form and would have previously meant assembly of gods. So one may even say nothing changes between the polytheistic and monotheistic versions of the myth, other than changing the meaning of the word Elohim to no longer mean the assembly of gods, but even the word itself stayed otherwise the same. There are two statements in the Old Testament that give away the transition from polytheism to monotheism. When the Most High, Elion and Hebrew, gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, in Hebrew. For the Lord's, Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted inheritance. What this passage says that the people of Jacob, the people of Israel, were allotted to Yahweh, who was originally only one of the gods of ancient Judea. Yahweh was to be the patron god of the Israelites. For Ugarit, the patron god was Baal. For Babylon, it was Marduk. For Assur, the original Assyrian capital, the patron gods were Ishtar and Ashur. The later Assyrian city of Nimrod had Ninurta as their patron god. El and Baal were among the patron gods of the Canaanites. They may have been viewed at times, respectively, as the father and brother of Yahweh. The fact that allusion to the Semitic gods survives in texts incorporated in the Old Testament suggests that these polytheistic beliefs were still remembered when the Old Testament was compiled in Greek. God, Elohim in Jewish, takes his stand in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods, Elohim again, but not with a capital E. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? I said, you are gods, son of the Most High. Elion in Hebrew. All of you, nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, Elohim in Hebrew. Judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. So this is the third reason why one cannot read the Old Testament literally. One would have to acknowledge the earlier polytheistic Semitic myths as retold in the Old Testament, including not just the many gods, but the beliefs in the earth and sky existing as a kind of bubble immersed in a universal ocean. This would then be the provenance of the Christian myths. So going then to the literal source of the myths would seem to reject monotheism and indeed the Christian church itself. No longer would we have Christianity or indeed monotheism if we go down that path. In addition, we would have to give up our belief in the applications of electricity and computers, telecommunications, the modern science of medicine, biology, or genetics. We should never fly anywhere for fear of the airplane crashing against the solid firmament or falling out of the existing world when leaving Mesopotamian airspace. It would be unwise to try to fly to America, which does not exist in the Babylonian view of the world. In fact, most of the world does not exist in the Babylonian view of the world. Rather, the literalists and fundamentalists might prefer instead that we may rest our faith in the Mesopotamian myths, according to which there are no stars or planets beyond the sky dome that covers Mesopotamia. We rather swim in a universal ocean that can cause rain to fall by the opening of doors on the solid firmament that let the waters of the universe pour through. There is perhaps a fourth reason why literalism fails, indeed by the admission of its own adherents who fail to observe the customs of circumcision and the dietary restrictions practiced at the time of Christ. Circumcision is commanded by God as an everlasting covenant for Abraham and all his male descendants, first introduced in Genesis 17:10-14. There it is said that every male child has to be circumcised on the 8th day after birth as a physical sign of belonging to God's chosen people. Furthermore, strict rules on what the Israelites can and cannot eat is found primarily in Leviticus 11. It is said that pigs, rabbits, and certain seafood such as octopus, catfish, shellfish, crayfish, and shrimp are forbidden to eat. It should be apparent that literalist Christians do not adhere to any of these simple commands, which are plainly stated and need no theological interpretation. That is the best case one can make for the fact that literalists actually do not read the texts literally. Their ulterior motive appears rather to be a hostility towards reason, and reading the text allegedly literally is an indirect assertion that reason is to be rejected. We are given 2 commandments which are said to be the like of each other. Indeed, when literally they appear to say different things. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. These 2 commandments are the essence of Christian belief. On the other hand, the stories of the book of Genesis are God-inspired in the sense in which St Gregory of Nyssa argued when saying that they can have the effect of bringing one closer to the Creator through the stories of the creation. The ancient stories have a certain appeal in the context of the Economia of the Church, and may have done so especially in ancient times. However, the modern literalist view, proposing that one must believe in these aspects of the Genesis narrative in the historical and scientific sense, is harmful to the Church, especially when such a view is perceived by outsiders to be the view of all Christians and is rightfully criticized.